You have no idea who you're dealing with." The words echoed in my mind as I adjusted the black apron over my shoulders, trying to steady my trembling hands. The Grande Hotel's chandeliers threw fractured light across the polished marble floors, and each crystal glass on my tray rattled with the faintest touch. Rain had turned Manhattan into a glossy canvas outside, and every streetlight reflected like a spotlight onto the chaos of my heart. I forced a smile as I weaved through the crowded gala, my green eye scanning the room for any sign of misstep. I'd seen wealthy clients before, but nothing prepared me for the aura that hovered near the terrace doors. He moved through the room with a presence that seemed to bend the air itself, a tall figure in a perfectly tailored black suit. His dark hair was swept back neatly, eyes the color of a stormy ocean, sharp and assessing, calculating, reading everything at a glance. My breath caught the moment our eyes met across the room, and I felt the weight of the warning I had whispered moments ago, "Don't trust her," linger between us like an invisible tether. Ethan Caldwell, they would later whisper his name in hushed tones in every corner of the city, a man whose silence carried more authority than words ever could. He stepped closer, and the crowd seemed to part, unnoticed, as if the world itself recognized the danger and power that radiated from him. My palms were slick with sweat, clutching the tray so tightly I could feel the knuckles whitening, and yet I couldn't look away. A waiter bumped past, sending a ripple through the champagne flutes, the clink echoing like a warning drum, and I instinctively flinched, my gaze darting between him and the door. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly, not with anger but with understanding, and I felt a strange mix of fear and relief, the kind that twists your stomach into knots. The voices around us, the polite chatter, the soft strains of the string quartet, faded into a distant hum, leaving only the taut electricity of that gaze between us. He didn't move hastily or speak, his presence alone dictated the room's rhythm. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to melt into the shadows, yet something held me rooted to the spot, as if some invisible thread connected our fates. My heart hammered, echoing the rhythm of the rain against the windows, each drop a sharp punctuation mark, reminding me that danger and opportunity were often intertwined. I shifted slightly, the tray wobbling, and his dark eyes flickered to the movement, following it with precision that made my spine stiffen. He was silent, but his silence spoke volumes, a language I had spent years learning to interpret in the wrong ways with the wrong people. I reminded myself to breathe, counting each inhale, each exhale, trying to regain control over hands that refused to obey. Ethan took another step, the faint scent of expensive cologne brushing my awareness, mixing with the tension in the room until it became almost tangible. I whispered under my breath, almost to myself, "Stay calm. Just get through tonight." Yet the moment our eyes locked again, I realized that calm was a fragile illusion. Every instinct screamed that something was about to change, something that would alter the course of my night and perhaps my life. The storm outside mirrored the storm within me, thunder rolling over the city streets, lightning flashing briefly through the windows and illuminating the sharp lines of his face. He stopped a few feet from me, close enough that I could see the calculation behind those stormy eyes, the way he measured me, assessed the room, and silently claimed a space in it as his own. I swallowed hard, the taste of fear and anticipation mingling on my tongue, and the words I had whispered earlier echoed back, "Don't trust her." And yet, in that precise moment of silence, I understood that trust and danger were entwined in ways I was only beginning to comprehend. Each second stretched, the noise of the gala fading to the edges of perception, leaving only the pulse of the city outside and the silent storm between us. I adjusted the tray once more, my fingers brushing against the smooth crystal, and forced myself to take a step forward, toward the unknown, toward the unspoken challenge that Ethan Caldwell's gaze had presented, knowing that nothing about tonight would ever be the same. The sound of crystal glasses settling back into their trays barely registered over the hum of conversation, yet every subtle movement in the room seemed amplified under Ethan Caldwell's watchful gaze. I took a careful step toward the terrace, each heel clicking against the marble floor like a countdown, and I felt the pressure of his presence fold around me, invisible but unrelenting. Outside, the rain fell heavier, streaming down the windows in rivulets, and the streetlights reflected in the glass like distant beacons, offering the illusion of safety far beyond my reach. I kept my hand steady, gripping the tray as if it could anchor me, but my mind raced, calculating every option, every escape route, and yet understanding that none truly existed while he was observing. Ethan's dark eyes followed the smallest twitch of my fingers, the way I adjusted my black uniform, the slight hesitation in my step, and I could feel the unspoken message in that scrutiny. He noticed everything, and he weighed every reaction. A waiter passed by, bumping lightly against my elbow, and I flinched, not from the contact but from the realization that any misstep could alter the delicate balance of the room. Ethan did not speak, he did not need to. The tension wrapped around us like a taut wire, vibrating with the energy of anticipation and caution. I moved closer to the terrace door, glancing outward, seeing the blurred silhouettes of pedestrians hurrying through the downpour, unaware of the silent drama unfolding above them. I thought of the warning I had whispered earlier, the one that had triggered the subtle shift in his posture, and I understood that the moment had passed beyond words, existing instead in the silent understanding between us. My pulse hammered, each beat reverberating in my ears, and yet I forced myself to breathe, counting slowly, methodically, as if each exhale could reclaim a fraction of control over my body. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, and I felt the change, a quiet signal that his attention had narrowed, that he was isolating me from the crowd in a way that was almost imperceptible but undeniable. The chandeliers glinted off the edges of his suit, highlighting the sharp lines of his jaw and the stormy depths of his eyes that seemed to cut through pretense, through the surface of the gala, straight to the core of intentions and secrets. I swallowed hard, aware of the heat rising in my cheeks, not from embarrassment alone, but from the acute awareness that every step, every breath, was noted, evaluated, catalogued in silence. My thoughts flickered to the moments I had tried to prepare myself for such encounters, the rehearsed lines, the careful gestures, and I realized that none of it mattered against the quiet authority of his presence. A distant clatter of silverware echoed from the buffet, drawing my gaze momentarily, and when I returned it to him, he was closer, a fraction of a pace that seemed insignificant to anyone else but monumental to me. The air between us was thick, charged with a kind of electricity that made the gallery walls fade into insignificance. I adjusted the tray once more, smoothing the crystal flutes, and the faint scent of rain seeped through the open terrace doors, mingling with the subtle trace of his cologne, creating a sensory overlay that grounded me even as it heightened my anxiety. I was acutely aware of my heartbeat, of the tremor in my hands, of the taut line of tension running through my shoulders, and yet I moved forward, each step a testament to the fragile courage that pushed me toward the terrace, toward the edge of understanding, toward the invisible line that Ethan Caldwell had drawn with nothing more than a look. The room seemed to contract, the background noise dimmed, and I realized with a clarity that sent a shiver down my spine that this was no ordinary gathering, no simple shift at work. It was the beginning of a reckoning, silent yet unavoidable, and the rain outside fell harder, drumming against the windows in rhythm with the rapid pulse of my own anticipation, marking the passage of a moment that would not be forgotten. The terrace doors swung open with a gentle push, letting in the rhythmic patter of rain and the faint scent of wet asphalt that mingled with the perfume of the gala guests. I stepped onto the balcony, feeling the chill of the evening. Air crawled up my arms, and I hugged the tray close to my chest as if it could shield me from the intensity of the night. Ethan Caldwell remained several feet behind me, his posture unyielding, every inch of him radiating the kind of control that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I could sense his eyes tracking each movement I made, noting the subtle shiver of my hands, the way my breath caught as the wind tugged at my hair. The city sprawled beneath us in a cascade of lights reflecting off the rain-slicked streets, yet all my attention was anchored to the figure behind me, the quiet storm of authority that seemed to bend the world around him. A distant car horn blared, breaking the delicate silence, and I instinctively flinched, glancing back at him to see a shadow of acknowledgement cross his features, small but deliberate. He did not speak, but his presence alone conveyed more than words ever could, a subtle warning, a protective watchfulness, a challenge to remain poised under scrutiny. I shifted my weight, careful not to tilt the tray, and in that instant, the gravity of our situation pressed in on me. Every decision, every step, carried weight, and the realization that I was being observed so thoroughly made the air itself feel heavier. The rain fell harder now, a continuous curtain that softened the city sounds, isolating us in a cocoon of tension that was almost tangible. I swallowed, feeling the dry friction in my throat, and forced my legs to move toward the railing, scanning the streets below, calculating escape routes even though reason told me that any attempt at fleeing would be futile while he remained behind me. Ethan adjusted his stance, shifting slightly, and the change in his weight sent a subtle ripple through the space between us, an unspoken message that I felt in the pit of my stomach. He was patient, deliberate, and I understood that his silence was a test, a measurement of composure, an assessment of how far courage could stretch before faltering. The soft clink of crystal as a server moved through the ballroom below reached us faintly, and I realized that even the smallest sound seemed magnified when under his scrutiny. The wind carried the scent of wet stone and distant exhaust, tangling with the faint aroma of his cologne, creating a sensory tension that was both grounding and unsettling. My pulse raced, matching the rhythm of raindrops striking the balcony, and I focused on controlling each breath, slow and steady, while my mind mapped every detail of the terrace, the hotel, and the city beyond. He remained quiet, letting the rain, the night, and the cityscape become the stage upon which he commanded my attention. I took another careful step, feeling the smooth marble beneath my shoes, and knew instinctively that this moment was pivotal, that the awareness between us had shifted, that our silent understanding had just begun to write the rules for what was about to unfold. Each heartbeat echoed in my ears, resonant against the distant hum of traffic, the faint murmur of the gala, and the relentless cascade of rain, marking time in a way that was both oppressive and strangely clarifying. The night had settled over Manhattan like a velvet shroud, yet the electric tension between us was sharper than any storm, and I understood with a clarity that prickled my skin that every choice I made from this moment forward would be measured, catalogued, and weighed against the quiet, commanding presence of Ethan Caldwell, a man whose silence carried more meaning than words, whose observation demanded attention, and whose authority was as palpable as the chill of the rain wrapping around us. The wind gusted suddenly across the terrace, carrying with it a cold drizzle that made the edges of my black uniform cling uncomfortably to my arms. I gripped the tray tighter, feeling each crystal flute tremble slightly under the weight of my caution, and I forced myself to step toward the railing, trying to steady my racing heart. Ethan Caldwell remained a measured distance behind me, his presence dominating the space without a single word, the sharp lines of his jaw highlighted by the soft glow of city lights reflecting off the rain-slicked streets below. Every detail of him was precise, deliberate, and impossibly controlled, from the crisp tailoring of his suit to the subtle rhythm of his breathing, and I felt the undeniable pressure of being measured under that quiet scrutiny. The city below moved in blurred streaks of headlights and neon, but I was entirely conscious of the sound of the rain on the balcony, the faint hum of conversation from the gala inside, and the small movements that passed unnoticed by anyone else but him. My mind mapped each step, each possible misstep, and each chance of drawing his attention, even as I knew that his eyes had already catalogued every nuance of my posture, the trembling of my fingers, the shallow lift of my shoulders. The wind brought a sudden chill that made me shiver involuntarily, and his gaze shifted, sharp and unyielding, as if noting the reaction, weighing it for significance. I took a breath, counting carefully, letting the cold air fill my lungs and grounding myself against the tension that threatened to unseat my composure. Ethan did not move closer, yet his presence pressed in, a tangible weight that made the balcony feel smaller, the night air thicker. I adjusted my grip on the tray once more, sensing the delicate balance between movement and stillness, action and hesitation, and the silent communication that passed between us without a single word spoken. Every instinct urged me to maintain control, to keep my focus on the tray, on the space immediately around me, on the rhythm of my own heartbeat as it matched the cadence of raindrops against the stone railing. Yet I could not ignore the undercurrent of anticipation, the unspoken challenge that he had laid before me simply by existing in the same space, observing, assessing, commanding without uttering a sound. I shifted my weight carefully, testing the subtle balance of the wet marble beneath my shoes, and I felt his attention lock on the faintest motion, the tiniest adjustment of a crystal flute, as if the world had condensed into the space between us and nothing else existed. My pulse surged, a mixture of anxiety and awareness, and the night seemed to expand and contract in rhythm with the silent power he wielded effortlessly, the cityscape sprawling beneath us and yet irrelevant, the only reality the charged space that connected our gazes. Our movements, our quiet negotiation of space and attention. I exhaled slowly, letting the tension seep from my shoulders, and yet I remained fully conscious of the gravity of the moment, the subtle electricity that made the air vibrate between us, and the understanding that each step I took, each breath I drew, carried the weight of a silent agreement, unspoken but firmly established, as we navigated the terrace in a dance of observation, patience, and inevitable consequence under the unyielding watch of Ethan Caldwell. The terrace air shifted subtly as I adjusted my stance, my fingers brushing against the edge of the tray, and I became acutely aware of the space between us, a space that was charged with unspoken expectations and quiet authority. Ethan Caldwell remained motionless, a measured presence that seemed to bend the night around him, and I felt the weight of his attention in a way that made every small movement I made feel deliberate, significant, consequential. The rain fell steadily, a soft percussion on the balcony, and the distant lights of Manhattan shimmered through the water-streaked glass, creating a kaleidoscope of reflection that drew my eyes outward even as I remained tethered to his gaze. My pulse was rapid, matching the rhythm of the raindrops striking the stone railing, and I forced myself to inhale slowly, to ground my awareness in the cool night air, to maintain the poise that had carried me this far. Each breath I took seemed to stretch the moment, elongating the quiet between us, and I could sense the subtle shift in his focus as he registered every detail of my posture, the tilt of my head, the tension in my shoulders. The faint hum of the gala below reached us intermittently, muted by the heavy rain, and I felt the isolation of the terrace, the way it became a separate world, a microcosm where only the two of us existed in an unspoken negotiation of awareness, restraint, and measured attention. I took a careful step toward the railing, feeling the smooth marble beneath my shoes, and my grip on the tray tightened instinctively as my mind catalogued every possible misstep, every nuance that could attract or repel his attention. Ethan's presence was magnetic and authoritative, silent but compelling, and I felt the pressure of being observed not as a threat but as an assessment, a measurement of how I navigated tension, perception, and my own composure. The drizzle traced cold paths down my arms, mingling with the warmth rising from my skin, and I shivered subtly, aware that he had noticed, that his awareness encompassed even the subtlest involuntary motion. I exhaled carefully, letting the air flow in rhythm with my heartbeat, grounding myself, and yet fully conscious that this was no ordinary interaction, no simple encounter between two people in a crowded space. The city beyond the balcony spread out in waves of light and reflection, but it was distant, irrelevant, overshadowed by the silent understanding that passed between us, the subtle but undeniable exchange of presence, attention, and judgment. I shifted slightly, adjusting the tray, and felt the unspoken communication in the slightest change in his posture, the faint narrowing of his eyes, a signal that required no words yet conveyed immense significance. The rain continued its steady rhythm, the terrace echoing with the soft drip from the roof above, the night air thick with anticipation, and I understood that this moment, suspended in silence, was pivotal, a delicate balance of power, trust, and observation, and that every choice I made from here on out would be catalogued, considered, and weighed under the unwavering, silent scrutiny of Ethan Caldwell, whose presence commanded the night without a single uttered sound. The chill of the rain had seeped into my bones, yet I remained rooted to the terrace, gripping the tray as if it were a lifeline, feeling the weight of the night and the city pressing in around me. Ethan Caldwell's presence was a constant, measured and unwavering, and I sensed his focus sharpening, the subtle shift in his posture signaling an awareness that went beyond observation. It was an assessment of resilience, of composure, of instinct. I took a careful step toward the edge of the balcony, eyes flicking toward the street below where the glow of headlights danced across puddles, momentarily capturing the reflection of my own apprehension. My heart thudded in sync with the rain, each beat a loud declaration in the quiet storm between us, and I forced myself to inhale steadily, drawing in the cold, damp air to center my racing thoughts. Ethan did not move, yet his presence seemed to fill the space entirely, and I felt the invisible pressure of his authority, a silent command that compelled me to measure every gesture, every micro-movement, to maintain the poise that had carried me this far. The faint hum of the gala inside reached us, distorted by the thick glass doors and the steady curtain of rain, and I became acutely aware of the separation, the terrace transforming into a private arena where our silent interaction took precedence over the world beyond. I adjusted the tray, the soft clink of crystal under my touch echoing faintly, and felt the shift of his gaze, intense and calculating, noting each detail, each reaction, each tremor of uncertainty. My pulse quickened, awareness sharpening, every sound amplified, every shadow a potential distraction, yet I remained focused on the measured distance between us, the rhythm of our silent communication, and the unspoken expectations that hovered with an almost tangible weight. I moved slightly, testing the wet marble beneath my shoes, and Ethan's eyes followed with precision, reading the subtle tension in my shoulders, the careful tilt of my head, the fraction of hesitation in my steps. The rain intensified, drumming against the balcony with a persistent cadence that mirrored the quickening tempo of my thoughts, and I realized that each breath, each deliberate motion, was a negotiation of presence and attention, a careful balance that defined the night. I exhaled slowly, feeling the cold air fill my lungs, grounding myself while the charged tension between us remained, a quiet understanding of boundaries, awareness, and silent respect. Ethan's silence was deliberate, measured, and commanding, and I understood that his observation was not intrusive but evaluative, a careful watch over the interplay of courage, composure, and intuition. The city lights stretched out endlessly beyond the balcony, yet all that mattered was the charged space between us, the delicate equilibrium of observation, reaction, and silent acknowledgement, and I felt the profound gravity of that balance as I navigated the terrace with cautious precision, aware that each step, each breath, and each movement was catalogued under the unwavering scrutiny of Ethan Caldwell, whose presence alone dictated the rhythm and intensity of the moment. The balcony felt smaller now, the space between us charged and electric, and I realized with a sudden clarity that each subtle movement I made was magnified under Ethan Caldwell's gaze, every shift of my weight, every slight adjustment of the tray, catalogued and measured with meticulous attention. The rain continued its relentless patter, the drops bouncing off the railing in a rhythmic percussion that seemed to echo the rapid tempo of my thoughts, and I drew in a deep breath, trying to center myself in the midst of tension that had grown almost palpable. Ethan stepped closer, not with haste but with deliberate control, the faint click of his polished shoes on the marble floor barely audible yet commanding in its presence, and I could feel the invisible pressure of proximity pressing against the air around me. My fingers tightened around the tray, the crystal flutes quivering slightly beneath the weight of anticipation, and I forced myself to focus on the task at hand, to maintain poise, even as my pulse hammered in my ears and my mind raced through every possible contingency, every possible outcome of this silent, high-stakes exchange. The city lights reflected off the wet streets below, creating an almost surreal backdrop that contrasted sharply with the intensity between us, yet I could not allow myself to be distracted by the spectacle. The night had become a crucible of observation, a test of composure, and a subtle negotiation of power and awareness. I shifted slightly, feeling the smooth cold marble under my shoes, and Ethan's eyes followed every movement, calculating, assessing, and silently conveying that he noticed every tremor, every hesitation, every fleeting expression of emotion. The wind swept across the terrace, carrying the sharp scent of rain and the faint tang of the city, and I shivered, aware that he had registered the movement, the subtle tightening of my shoulders, the careful lift of my chin. A distant murmur from the gala below reached our ears, muffled by the thick glass doors, but within the bubble of the terrace, it was nearly imperceptible, leaving only the charged silence between us, the quiet dialogue of presence and attention, and the slow realization that the balance of the evening rested entirely on this delicate interaction. I inhaled slowly, feeling the cool damp air fill my lungs, and with each measured exhale, I tried to steady the tremor in my hands, grounding myself in the rhythm of the rain, the city, and the silent authority that Ethan projected. He moved with a subtle, controlled grace that made the space feel fluid, almost like the terrace had become a stage for an intricate dance, one where each step, each gesture, each inhalation and exhalation carried weight and meaning. My focus narrowed, awareness sharpening to the edges of perception, and I recognized that this encounter, silent and deliberate, was forging a bond of observation, respect, and cautious trust, a tether invisible yet undeniable, drawing us together in the stillness of the storm, as the night stretched on and the rain continued to fall, relentless, steady, and indifferent to the fragile human tension it accentuated, marking each heartbeat, each breath, and each motion under the unyielding, watchful eyes of Ethan Caldwell. The rain had slowed to a steady drizzle, the city lights casting elongated reflections across the wet pavement below, and I stood on the terrace, acutely aware of every detail around me, from the gentle sway of the railing under my hands to the subtle shift in Ethan Caldwell's stance behind me. Each heartbeat pulsed in rhythm with the droplets striking the stone, a quiet percussion that mirrored the tension tightening in my chest, and I forced myself to maintain poise, to steady the tray that had become an extension of my focus. Ethan's presence was absolute, unspoken, and commanding, a silent gravity that drew my awareness entirely toward him, making every movement deliberate, every breath measured. The balcony felt both expansive and confining, a private world carved out in the midst of the storm, where the city beyond was distant and muted, leaving only the charged space between us. I adjusted my footing carefully, the cold marble under my shoes reminding me of the precarious balance, and I could feel the subtle weight of his observation, the way his eyes traced each nuance of posture, the tilt of my head, the delicate shift of my shoulders. A gust of wind brought a brief shiver, and I drew the coat tighter around myself, sensing that Ethan noted every involuntary reaction, cataloguing my composure and my restraint in the silent ledger of his attention. I exhaled slowly, grounding myself against the rising tension, and I realized that the anticipation between us had transformed into an unspoken dialogue, a measured exchange of awareness, judgment, and subtle communication that required no words. The soft murmur of conversation from the gala inside was distant, almost irrelevant, as the terrace became a stage for this intricate and silent negotiation, where patience, focus, and instinct ruled the space. My gaze flicked momentarily to the cityscape, the streaks of headlights and neon glowing through the rain, but my attention returned immediately to the precise placement of his presence, the way he commanded the environment with a quiet authority that made everything else fade into the background. I shifted slightly, feeling the marble cool beneath my shoes, and he did not move, yet I felt the pressure of expectation, the silent challenge of measuring courage, composure, and instinct, and I understood that my choices were observed and assessed with meticulous care. The drizzle persisted, blending with the subtle scent of the city and the faint aroma of his cologne, creating a layered sensory experience that heightened every moment, every awareness, every small motion. I drew another slow, deliberate breath, the air filling my lungs, and with each exhale, I felt a cautious sense of control, tempered by the recognition that the night was far from ordinary, that the space between us had become a crucible of perception, and that every decision, every subtle gesture, and every heartbeat was catalogued under the silent, unwavering scrutiny of Ethan Caldwell, whose presence defined the rhythm, weight, and significance of the moment, leaving me fully conscious of the delicate balance of power, observation, and anticipation that would guide what came next. The rain had almost ceased, leaving a faint mist that clung to the balcony and softened the glow of the city lights, creating a quiet, reflective atmosphere. I set the tray down on the marble ledge, feeling the cool surface under my palms and taking a deep breath to steady the tension that had coiled through me all evening. Ethan Caldwell remained a few feet behind, his posture calm but unmistakably deliberate, every detail of his presence communicating a steady, unspoken authority. The storm outside had faded to a gentle drizzle, but the energy between us remained taut, a fragile thread stretched across the terrace, carrying the weight of anticipation, awareness, and mutual observation. I shifted slightly, brushing damp strands of hair from my face, and felt the subtle acknowledgement in the way his eyes followed the motion, registering the smallest flicker of emotion, the faintest hesitation in my stance. The city below was bathed in reflections of neon and streetlights, the wet streets shimmering like liquid glass, but my focus remained entirely on the space between us, the silent dialogue of glances, gestures, and measured presence. I exhaled slowly, feeling the cool air fill my lungs, and with each breath, I felt a tentative control, a careful balance of composure and awareness, knowing that every micro-movement was observed, assessed, catalogued by the quiet gravity of his gaze. Ethan took a measured step closer, not breaking the unspoken distance but closing the invisible gap just enough to intensify the connection, and I felt the air shift, charged with silent communication, subtle yet profound, a language that required no words. My fingers rested lightly on the tray, each motion deliberate, and I noticed the slight narrowing of his eyes, the imperceptible tilt of his head, signals that spoke volumes without a single sound, conveying recognition, attention, and expectation. I turned slightly to look over the city, taking in the faint glow of distant traffic and the sheen of wet rooftops, and yet the reflections were secondary to the awareness of his presence, a quiet insistence that I acknowledge the weight of this moment, the importance of observation, and the unspoken bond that had been established over the course of the evening. I breathed deeply, letting the mist touch my face, grounding myself in the cool, damp air while remaining fully conscious of the deliberate cadence of his movements, the careful rhythm of his silence, and the way that his presence seemed to define the night itself. The terrace, the rain, the city, and the fading storm had become a backdrop for a moment of subtle understanding, where tension, awareness, and cautious trust intertwined, creating a space in which every decision, every movement, and every measured breath mattered. I felt the quiet weight of anticipation, the delicate equilibrium of observation and comprehension, and in that suspended moment, I recognized the profound significance of Ethan Caldwell's presence, a steady, unwavering force that framed the night, marked the passage of time, and set the tone for everything that was to follow, leaving me fully aware that the silent, deliberate connection we shared on that terrace would shape what came next.